Summit. And Tom Reardon's ready to talk. I can see that. Okay.
Am I first?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, you're the first here, but
Okay. I had a surge of adrenaline when you said that, so there.
Carl, we're still waiting on Ousmane. So if you would like, and I know Sarah isn't able to join us, so if you'd like, I could go right into David Zilberman's video.
No, let's make sure Will Martin, Will Martin is the moderator of this session. So can you elevate him?
Yeah, so he is in, and I did send him an invite to come up as a panelist. So Will, just make sure you're accepting that invite, please. Okay, Will, it doesn't look like you are up as a panelist, but you do have the permission to unmute now. Please excuse us. It seems we're having a little technical difficulty. Anwar, there is a question for you in the chat if you want to answer while we navigate this technical issue.
Anwar doesn't want to.
Oh no, Anwar doesn't want to. What do you think of that? That's quite a loaded hypothetical question, Amahle. I mean, I wish I had a crystal ball. I think, again, we would like to think that if the right policies are followed and the right investments are made, then certainly these issues of food security can be resolved. I guess that'd be the easy answer. I don't know.
All right, so thank you, Anwar. It looks like Will is able to join us, and it looks like he is. Will, your session is starting now. So
okay,
we are still waiting on Ousmane, who is set to go first. And Sarah is not able to join us. I do have a video from David Zilberman, so let us know how you would like to proceed.
okay. Well, I guess the key thing is Ousmane. I was planning to start with Ousmane. I guess if Ousmane doesn't arrive immediately, perhaps what we should do is start with David Zilberman's talk.
Okay. All right.
Would that make sense? And then we can rearrange.
I have a video for David Zilberman, so I will play that now.
Okay, but before you do, I mean, I think this is a very important session. Just as by way of introduction, we're looking at the recent UN Food Systems Summit, very, very high level. So what were the outcomes of that? What will its impact be? And we have an outstanding panel to address those questions. David Zilberman, of course, a Robinson professor at the University of California at Berkeley, where he's been since 1979. He is also the recipient of the Wolf Prize, an extremely prestigious prize that goes way beyond our discipline. Within our discipline, recent president of the Applied and Agriculture and Applied Economics Association, and an honorary life member of the International Association of Agricultural Economists. Always got something interesting and important to say, so I commend his presentation to us. I look forward to it very much.
Thank you. I did message Ousmane, so hopefully they can join us before the end of today. So
okay, great.
right. Sorry, bear with me one moment.
Okay. Good afternoon, good morning. I'm really sorry that I cannot be with you in person. And I'm sure that you enjoyed this wonderful meeting, but I'll try to do my best by making this presentation about the implication of UN Food System Summit on Agricultural Technology. I was in the Science Advisory Board for the World Food Summit. That I like to share. Okay. Good afternoon, good morning. I'm really sorry that I cannot be with you in person. And I'm sure that you enjoyed this wonderful meeting, but I'll try to do my best by making this presentation about the implication of UN Food System Summit on Agricultural Technology. I was in the Science Advisory Board for the World Food Summit, and this was quite an interesting experience that I like to share some of the main elements with you. I think that there were several things that came out of it. First, that there are alternative vision of agriculture. One vision is what I can call the romantic, organic, and agroecology vision. People really would like to see agriculture without any pesticide, without any commercial unit, mostly using technologies of agroecology, mostly using organic farmer. I found that this would have been a fantastic agricultural system if we have 2 billion people, but cannot feed 7 or 10 billion people. It has, in my view, 2 major features. One feature is that the rich guiding the poor in order not to repeat the developed world mistake. Okay, we made mistakes, so you shouldn't do it. What are our mistakes? Commercial agriculture, pesticide, etc. Even though with this mistake, our life expectancy is going much higher, and people want to migrate to the developed world. The other thing is that people that push this approach are people that pursue product differentiation. They know that people will pay a lot, and rich people will pay much more to take advantage of the fact that they have specific product, that they can deal with the risk aversion. So this is an approach that has been promoted very heavily. The other vision of agriculture, I can call it food plus. This is the approach that is taken by most of the agriculturalists of today. You look at today's technology with continuous improvement. We continue to feed the world, but agriculture was mostly be for food. It's a status quo approach. It's something that you don't require a lot of imagination, a lot of belief. And basically it said, okay, we need to be a little bit more environmentally conscious. We need to reduce greenhouse gases, but we need to provide more capacity to developing countries, but agriculture should produce food. The third approach that obviously I subscribe to is the bioeconomy. That agriculture is much more than food. It will be a key to move to a renewable economy and address climate change. We can, with agriculture, we produce biofuel, green chemistry, pharmaceutical. And the key element is to use advanced science in terms of molecular biology, as well as ecology to introduce new vision of agriculture. Now, the big issue is regulation that are against biotechnology. So while in medicine we rely on CRISPR, we develop new vaccine with modern technology. In agriculture, we have a lot of regulation. Now, as we all know, biotechnology can help and can help the poor and produce more food and produce more land. We can, with biotechnology, enhance photosynthesis and produce more than food on the same amount of land. So these are the third vision, and they are fighting. Within the science advisory board, I think that at least 50% were consistent with the bioeconomy vision. They really saw agriculture having the huge potential, but there was a lot of concern about poverty, a lot of concern of what you do with the poor, but it was realized that if you develop a good system of provision of education and knowledge, it can help the poor. The second element that we saw is the issue of disagreement. One issue is the regulation of biotechnology. Many of us would like to have much lighter regulation. I think that was quite a significant part of the majority. Of course, you need to regulate biotechnology, but you also need to make it happen, and you cannot have heavy-duty precautionary principles. Another thing is the future of small farmers. As there was few of them that thought that the small farmers can become much better off with better technology, but I think most people agree that scale, that the too small cannot be too rich, and scale is a problem. You need some consolidation. And if you look at developing countries, with more consolidation of land, less population growth, development of rural industry, and improving the city, you can really shift away from agriculture to better use of human resources. Furthermore, the uses are attracted to the city, so we really need to modernize agriculture in developing countries. So this is one issue of debate. A second issue of debate is the role of the state versus NGOs. A lot of people felt that NGOs are really crucial, and we need to end almost at a partnership between the state and NGO. But to me, it's clear that the state should control the state. And the NGO can be very useful, but they are secondary to the state. A third issue is what the role of the CGIAR. Some people thought, gosh, it will continue what it has been doing. There was also more emphasis on maybe the CGIAR should not be only university research institutes, that should be the core for agricultural universities, engaging in extension, get more money so they will develop the intellectual capacity, especially in Africa, to improve agriculture. And then there was an idea to develop some sort of international intergovernmental panel of food, what they call IPF, and some people really liked it. I was a little bit cool on it, but this was another issue of controversy. It wasn't established, but it's not dead. Now, what are the politicking that we have there? There was a lot of politicking. First, my subjective impression, Europe is a major player. European universities are very influential. Americans are more influential than individuals. I felt that Wageningen and Bonn and other universities have people there. Most of the big players were European and their African sidekicks. There was very little American except me and Tom Ertl that were really involved. It also feels that the US government was interested but not very active. I spoke with someone from the US, from the chief economist of USDA, and actually it's Elise Hardy, and he was very knowledgeable, but I don't think that anyone from AID spoke with me or Erto. People from other countries spoke with their agencies all the time. So I'm not sure how much the US is interested in all these issues. And I think that other countries, I heard it, realize that the US doesn't care. And I think that America first, people feel that we have a different president, but we still have America first. Third thing that I found is that FAO want to play a major role, and therefore they oppose this intergovernmental panel on food. They want to be this international panel on food. To be honest, they were much, much better than in the past. They did a lot of good support of the work, and they really provided a lot of good information. NGOs are really pushing it in any possible way. I got tons of emails from NGOs about what to do, how to do it, why we should move to agroecology, and they could have been quite nasty about their demand. They wanted to boycott the summit. On the other hand, corporations are very, very shy. The chief scientist of corporation spoke, but I don't think that they have a lot of weight. The corporations are much more effective when they work with universities. Now, everyone speaks for the poor, and there was this element that the main element was about poverty. There was much less speaking about poor system, about real food system, how to design them. All the interesting thing about supply chain was really pushed. And there was some discussion of the pandemic, but I really feel that it's still business for usual, how to increase farming within, how to increase productivity of small farmers, how to deal with production at the farm level, while the action is outside the farm gate, the action is supply chain. I felt that corporations don't speak, they do. The private sector build a new supermarket, do a lot of things that make a big difference, and they really affect what's going on, but they really don't want to speak because they find that this element of helping the poor is part of the picture, but the big action is building the economy. My perspective is that we really need two types of approach. We need to enhance growth and improve productivity in developing countries, and rather than be a donor and only try to help the poor. We really need to think about being a partner and develop economic, a strong developing economy so we can work within the world, while at the same time increasing resilience and developing emergency services. But these perspectives that we all the time try to worry about the poor within a context and don't being realistic about how supply chain evolve, in my view, is not very productive. Thank you, and I hope to see you in another time. Bye-bye.
Terrific. One question. Is Ousmane available?
I believe they should be here. Let me just bring them up.
Okay, great. It was an excellent presentation from David, as expected. Ousmane, welcome.
Good seeing you, everyone here. Let me go quickly and share my screen.
Sure.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, everybody. Sorry I came in a little bit late.
It's fine. So, yeah, just before you start, Ousmane, I wanted to, by way of introduction to someone who genuinely needs no introduction, but Ousmane comes to us with an astoundingly distinguished background. He was the World Bank's lead for agricultural policy in Africa. He had a long stint at IFPRI before and after his stint at the World Bank. Later, until recently, he was IFPRI's director for Africa. He's now leading Academia 2063, and hence in an excellent position to give us an assessment from Africa on the impact of the UN Food Systems Summit on African agricultural policies. So looking forward to hearing, Ousmane. It's over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Will. It's very kind and generous. And thank you for inviting me to this event, Carly and others. It's a big pleasure. So let me go quickly. I was just thinking aloud about what the UN Food Systems Summit might have in terms of an impact on African agricultural policies, as you required me to do. So what I will do is just to start looking at where we are right now, because the summit took place at a very critical junction in the development of African economies. It's coming at a time when, unlike in any other precedent period, African agriculture is doing better than the rest of the world. It has never happened before. Yes, we're still at very low level, but we used to be at very low level too. And the red line that you see here that shows agricultural value added index in contents US dollars, this line used to be at the bottom here and flat. So something important, at least from the point of view of Africa, no matter how small it is, something important took place over the last 20 years. So with the Food Systems Summit starting now, the question is, what will it do to help us sustain this trajectory? Does it involve any risks that may distract us from this trajectory? And similar questions. And I'm just reflecting aloud about that. We need to stay the course, and anything that comes from the global community should help us stay this course and even magnify it for the reason on my next slide. These lost decades of the 70s all the way to the early 2000s have put us in a very, very difficult situation. Despite this strong recovery that you see, the strong performance is really just late after so many decades of stagnation and decline. In fact, we're still below where we would have been if we had continued the trajectory of the 60s. So therefore, whatever happens around a global agenda in Africa should help Africa move forward and intensify and accelerate the recovery over the last 20 years. It is important to keep in mind that there is a reason why Africa is growing this way. There are a lot of things that were being done wrong in the 70s and the 80s, actually starting in the late 60s. We corrected those. But also there is a new dynamism across Africa. There's no room here to go into the details, but the fact that African countries have been able to come together around a common agenda, shared principles, shared targets, and shared modalities allowed one simple thing that we never had in the past. This is really important, is the continuity of efforts. That continuity of efforts allowed intensity and cumulative progress, building brick by brick on the same building basically to move forward. That has been extremely important. in allowing African countries to achieve progress over the last 20 years. Now, will a new food system summit agenda be helpful to that, enhance it, strengthen it, or will it be destructive to that? I don't think there's any intention for it to be destructive to that, but the implementation of global agendas include a multitude of actors that might be running a multitude of agenda that will miss the need to align and therefore to strengthen what's happening on the ground. And here is what happened from the 50s to the 2000 before CADEP. And I spent a little bit of time on this graph here to show how shifting policy priorities and strategies were related to the lack of focus and continuity of development efforts in Africa. That could have explained the stagnation we had. Here I'm starting here, let me look at the two axes here. It is the tension that we had. I'm not saying we have the same now, but to explain, we can have different tensions this time around, and we'll talk about that. But here's the tension we had, how much the government should lead. This is the early independence areas, and how much should we rely on the private sector and the market? Or how much should we go industry and urban, or in contrast to rural and agriculture? This tension has shaped policies and strategies in Africa's agriculture over the last 6 decades. So we started with a very focused, a strong focus, as most of you know, on industry-led import substitution in the 60s. I don't want to comment too much on it. But then we shifted to basic needs in the 70s, away from industry focus, a little bit closer to agriculture, and still on the government side though, still government leading the efforts on the basic needs. We shifted back down towards the markets and closer to the middle around the social adjustment policies in the 80s and the 90s, with the difficulty we had in having impact on people's and livelihood. There's a little bit of a shift towards agriculture and the rural areas in the PRSPs, poverty reduction strategy of the 90s and 2000. It wasn't until the 2000 that the focus and the emphasis on agriculture-led growth started with CADEP. And that has been sustained for 2 decades. It's the difference between what happened in the 2000s and the earlier decades, that all these were globally led, externally initiated policy and strategy focuses that did not allow African countries to own and lead and focus and build gradually to get progress. We are now here. It's a post-CADEP or CADEP plus period that we're looking at now, and how that is going to be interacting with the UN Food System Summit agenda. So as we're thinking about what the impact could be, we're returning to these shifting agendas, which I think is highly improbable, because Africans have figured out that leading the agenda and owning it has been instrumental. But anything that distracts us in carrying out that ownership and leadership and doing that consistently, effectively, is going to be creating some headwinds somehow. And therefore, the impact is still not guaranteed to be positive. And we have to keep an eye on that and try and push it. So here is what happened over the last 20 years and why it is important to continue to align with the African agenda. Early on in the 2000s, African countries came together, defined shared targets, goals, and accountability principles. With the Maputo Declaration, they committed in very simple ways to just 2 joint common targets across the continent: grow at 6%, invest 10%. Some have achieved, some have not, but the value of that is not just in having achieved these goals, but the collective agenda setting that has allowed countries to focus at least and trying to achieve something very simple and very concrete has had tremendous impact. Then the innovation around this agenda, the country and regional accountability processes. Here it was the joint sector reviews that allowed countries to have inclusive dialogues to look at whether or not agriculture is moving. That may sound very trivial, but what it does actually influences how programs are being developed, how money is being allocated, and who is around the table. In the Malabo Declaration, 10 years later, they expanded now the target to 7 areas. I'll talk about that. And they lifted their accountability processes to the continental level. It's not just at the country regional level that we're looking at results, but now we're holding ourselves accountable to action and to results at the continental level, where heads of states look at each other in the eyes. Again, that may sound trivial, but that goes back with them when they decide and discuss how to forge development programs at home. So in the post-UN Food System Summit, it's going to be important to align with those way of doing business in Africa to ensure continuity. So how can we do that? There are few things that have to be the focus of what we do. No matter how the action areas are defined, the coalitions are defined, you break it down in Africa, we need 5 simple things. And I think that's what this agenda should do for us. We need to sustain and active productivity growth. I see David reversed to that earlier. We need to foster value chain transformation. Whatever the agenda is, it has to boost competitiveness of the processing sector, not because it's fancy, but the processing sector right now in Africa, where we are in our level of development, is what infrastructure used to be in the 70s and 80s. When we're talking about track and trails and rural roads, because that infrastructure was instrumental in linking smallholder farmers to the growing markets. Today, it's the processing sector. If your traditional staples are not processed, are not packaged, ready to cook, ready to eat, you are cut off the urban markets that's growing in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So these processing sectors need to remain competitive for the African smallholders to cash into that market. Then, of course, that extends to promoting intra-African trade, not just a major goal of the African agenda, but a must for African countries, resilience, growth, attractiveness, you name it, right? And finally, of course, resilience to changing climate. So these would be the criteria for what kind of activities should be pursued at post-Food System Summit. Fortunately, there is a scope for alignment. That will require, first and foremost, that the global agencies and actors seek to enhance, to build on, and to reinforce the African agenda. Those slides that I showed, the targets that are shared in the Malabo commitments, the modalities for mutual accountability, that in the countries that we share the same targets, goals, the priorities, and the same mutual accountability processes. So in my last slide, I just have tentatively put together a matrix to show where there is an overlap between the Malabo commitments and the action areas that have emerged from the Food Systems Summit. And as you see, in several rows of columns, there are several stars or crosses that allow us actually to build upon what's happening in Africa and still reach the outcomes from the UN Food System Summit. There are 2 areas where it's a little bit of a question mark how much alignment ought to be. It is the one on intra-African trade. The Global Food System Summit has been a little bit quiet on that, but I think intra-African trade is going to be quite important in spreading growth and therefore in advancing equitable livelihoods and empowering communities and decent work. However, it needs to be articulated better. Then the boosting nature-based solutions and production is not highlighted the way it is in the UN Food Systems. It's not highlighted that way in the African agenda, which is an opportunity for African countries to look at alternative ways of making agricultural production much more resilient and much more adapted to a changing climate. One difficulty here is that from the point of view of the UN Food Systems Summit, nature-based solution ranks extremely high and is likely to be brought to Africa as a new paradigm. Actually, somebody used that word to me. We need a shift in paradigm in Africa, was somebody telling me, who is not connected to the African countries, not to the African Union, has not been elected by any African countries, and not working with any African organization. But the person was telling me we need a change of paradigm in Africa. I think we have to be a little bit careful there. whether it's agroecology or whatever it is, we ought to test those across these 5 points here. Are they helping us sustain and accelerate productivity growth? Are they helping us foster value chain transformation? Are they helping us boost competitiveness processing, promoting Africa trade, enhancing resilience? If they don't do those together, then we have to align and refine them so that they can do that, not just focusing on an agenda that may be more of an importance in the North. And my last statement here is that we talk about food systems. They may have the same components, the same segments, but each of these components weighs differently based on the different economies. And in Africa, different components weighs differently than it would be in the North. It would be a mistake to look at this from the lens of the North and push the segments and the weights of the North and try to transfer them to Africa. And I hope and I think it will not happen. So I'll stop here and thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you very much, Ousmane, for an excellent presentation. One with actually a lot of complementarity with the points that David Zilberman made in his initial presentation, the role of agroecology and so on. There's a very nice interconnection there. Thank you. I think everyone knows that Sarah Savastano unfortunately won't be able to make it. So our third presenter is Tom Reardon from Michigan State University. Tom is a distinguished professor at Michigan State who's written very extensively and very, very thoughtfully on agricultural economics. He's responsible for sayings like the missing middle. He's pointed to the dramatic changes which are taking place in agricultural value chains, especially the rise of the supermarkets, including in Africa. He's bound to have interesting, stimulating, thoughtful things to say. He is, of course, a fellow of the Agriculture and Applied Economics Association and an honorary life member of the International Association of Agricultural Economists, amongst many other distinctions. So it's over to you, Tom, to share your thoughts with us. You're not going to give us a death by PowerPoint. You're actually going to talk using words. So over to you. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Will. And I hope you can speak someday at my funeral. I felt so proud, even if it's barely true. But thank you very much. I really liked the first two talks by David and by Ousmane, and I find myself agreeing thoroughly with both of them, and I have a kind of an extension of them. One thing that Ousmane just said that really resonated with me is that there was a great deal of feeling from my point of view, and I'll say what my role had been in the summit, that there was a lens of the North brought to bear on the reality and the priorities and issues of, let's say, the global South, and we're talking about Africa here. And I felt more and more as I've been exposed to those two debates or points of view of the global North and of the global South, that really they're almost like two ships passing in the night. That the global North situation is one of post-industrialization, food is already cheap, food security is there. The passions have turned to reversing some of that wheel back toward local food, kind of a nostalgia. Certainly it can't feed the billions of people in the North, but there's this feeling that we need to move back to that. There's a focus on sustainability, which is of course excellent, but it's based on an already accomplished food security. And for me, the global South in general, and let's say the African situation, is in the midst of an attempt and a focus on rapid commoditization, on rapid building of and development of food supply chains, of rapid urbanization, where urban areas, for example, in Africa, are 60% of the food consumed in Africa are in urban areas. And 20% of the food is purchased, 50% of the food in rural areas is purchased. So that makes 80% of all food in Africa is purchased, all consumed food. So that right now the focus is on getting supply chains moving, getting productivity moving, all the things that Ousmane emphasized. And I would add simply that domestic supply chains are extremely important, and far more than trade at the moment, but eventually trade will also be more and more important. So I think aligning with that idea of what can keep that growth moving and make it more and more equitable and sustainable is the way to go, instead of saying, let's crumple that up, produce a new paradigm. So my role this past year, I'll talk about what I observed briefly, and then how I see it fundamentally contradicted by facts that have come out of USAID funded field research, and then finally come back to my own feelings about how to move forward. I was the small and medium enterprise, SME, focal point for Action Track 5, which was the, it's basically the resilience building for the food systems, but I was exposed a lot to the other action tracks. And I found that there were, 3 themes that were emphasized by this action track of resilience and food system transformation by the UN Food Summit group. The first was that we need really to move back toward local food, local consumption, basically back toward self-sufficiency. Okay, so there was a local food movement was very dominant in the ideas. Secondly, there was a strong feeling that food systems in Africa are broken, are stagnant, and actually will had the right spirit but the wrong point, which is that the Food System Summit emphasized that there's a missing middle. Okay, that is that the SMEs are really broken and missing, and the services are not there. The thing is a mess. Well, what I will say is that instead there's a hidden middle, okay, with an extremely dynamic midstream that's been brewing and developing rapidly in Africa, largely on its own. Okay, so as I said, the first theme that they said is go local. The second one is what we already have is broken. Okay, and the third theme that came out of the deliberations were that, as David Zilberman emphasized, the roles and responsibilities of NGOs, and maybe also multilaterals, especially Rome-based agencies. And so what I really found missing all year is government. Okay, and Ousmane emphasized this in terms of will and of policy, but the things that are my passions, which are infrastructure, what I call the blood and bones of the food system, the wholesale markets, the roads, this almost never came up. Logistics, it almost never came up in the zillions of Zooms and hours that I clocked in. But instead, the role of the government that was emphasized is public safety nets. Okay, and I think I calculated one time that if you, the entire, let's say if you took all the agencies and you looked at their food safety net ability in terms of giving food away, it could feed Africa for 6 days. Okay, so when you think about it, the subject was a tiny thing, important in the specific places, but overall, the big things, which are how the whole food system is founded and based and functions, were not on the agenda. And so, secondly, overall, I want to just quickly contradict those assumptions and foci of the Food System Summit, at least the action track I was in. The first thing is this idea that the local food, local production, local consumption is the answer. Well, this is an answer. I think it's something like when David Zilberman said, not using inputs is good if you had a fifth of the people in the world. Well, it's the same thing. In Africa, 80% of the total food consumed in Africa goes through supply chains. Supply chains. The word wasn't even brought up practically during the year. 60% of the consumption is in cities, and then half of the rural area of consumption, which is the other 20%, is rural purchases that are huge. So already Africa's way beyond local food systems. It's already heavily dependent on the markets. It's not possible, and I would say it doesn't even make sense to think about trying to roll that back. Secondly, I'm passionate about this, is that this image, this is locked into the international debate. It's wrong beyond belief that the food systems are broken, they're missing middle, that they're stagnant. Instead, all of our research, this USAID funded research, shows that there's been instead a quiet revolution, that the small and medium enterprises have proliferated at an incredible rate, that really, instead of the missing middle, it's a hidden middle, hidden from the debate. And that the supply chains are tremendously dynamic, 800% growth in Africa in the past few decades. And we found in our research that when the blood and bones were present, like the wholesale markets were allowed to function, the roads were okay, there was tremendous resilience, even during the COVID, and there was tremendous growth. Okay, and the third point is that this focus on the safety net. We found in our research that even during COVID, almost nobody, like 1 or 2% of all of our samples in our constant surveys got any safety net during COVID. Okay, let's say you increase safety nets of governments by tenfold. It might affect 1 or 2% of consumption in Africa. Basically, 80% of the food consumption in Africa is moved by the private sector. Okay, the private sector are small enterprises mainly, and a little bit large enterprises. So the government that was left off the agenda of discussion so much really has this tremendous central role to play in terms of the blood and the bones. Blood, I call the logistics and the wholesale, the traders. And the bones are the wholesale markets and the roads and the enabling environment of the policies to be able to serve the domestic supply chain and also intra-Africa trade. Finally, I have 3 passionate feelings from all this. One is, don't reinvent the wheel. I felt all year as I sat through the 1,000 Zooms, I'm sure I should get some kind of a check in the mail from the Zoom Corporation. Okay, basically I felt like everybody was saying, let's build back better, let's reinvent the wheel, reinvent food systems, and let's do it especially through the NGOs and the multilaterals. And there wasn't an idea that, wait, there's already a tremendous, rapidly growing supply chain of food in Africa, and as well as Asia. Don't go and reinvent it. Try to figure out what are its constraints and let it grow faster and better. And secondly, as I said, the markets are crucial, and we found so many instances that I could go into detail where things are exploding already. And so the issue is go around and find where those the flames are starting, where the fires are starting, where the action is being created already. Help it. Don't reinvent it. Help it move faster. And last, focus on those fundamentals, blood and bones, okay, and the enabling environment. And I think that's been a super strength of USAID in the past, looking at the enabling environment and helping the private sector to move forward. This is this small scale and also in cases the large scale private sector, but especially the small scale private sector, which is 80% of African food system. Focus on the fundamentals to support and help it. And I'll end with an image given to me by Ousmane Badiane, okay, that the African food system is like a big jet. Okay, people say it hasn't taken off, it's broken. No, it's taken off. Right now it's flying at 10,000 feet. It could ascend to 35,000 feet with more of the fundamentals in place. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom, for that fascinating talk and bringing together, reinforcing the messages from our two previous speakers. Now, our final speaker on the formal panel is Jennifer Chow. Jennifer is the head for global engagement for the Bureau of Resilience and Food Security at USAID. So eminently qualified to speak to us. And Jennifer has promised to speak for about 10, 12 minutes to take us through to roughly 12:30. So looking forward to hearing from you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Will. I also do not have a PowerPoint. I'll just be speaking on my reflections and involvement in the summit as one of our leads for the agency. And I think I was asked to give some reflections on obviously how we've engaged and what we see coming out of it, what the implications of the summit are on our policy agenda or vice versa. So I think I'll start by reminding ourselves that as part of it, President Biden and Administrator Power announced at the summit that the US would continue to invest at an average of $1 billion a year over the next 5 years, right, through Feed the Future. So I think it's worth re-mentioning that this is a multi-year commitment and a commitment to expand Feed the Future's reach into more countries. And it's a significant contribution, significant indication by our government to sustain our commitment to these shared issues, really. And, you know, I think as Tom just said, rather than reinventing the wheel, I think a lot of what you may have heard come out of the US, especially where USAID might lead, is, of course, very much tied to our global food security strategy, which Administrator Power outlined recently, since we had a refresh, as we've called it here. So a lot of what we put forward includes areas that were discussed earlier this morning, research and innovation, especially in support of sustainable productivity growth, which many speakers have talked about, and which I'll talk about in the context of the summit. And I think for a quick review, you know, our priorities around this refreshed global food security strategy, equity and inclusion, addressing the impacts of climate change, COVID recovery, and a renewed focus on nutrition, specifically on affordable diet quality. These all speak to our goal of contributing to a 20% reduction in poverty and child stunting in the areas where we work. So I think to get into these a little bit, first, these priorities all speak to the holistic food systems approach that of course everybody's talking about. That was how the summit oriented itself, and which our global food security strategy embraces, while acknowledging that it is still the global food security strategy, right? So we're still keeping ourselves focused on the hoped for outcomes, which again are reductions in poverty, stunting, and food insecurity. I think that that really underlines a lot of what previous speakers before me have talked about in various ways and in their research as well. So what do all these commitments and announcements look like for our policy and global engagement agenda and our work with partner countries? So on climate, of course, many speakers have already acknowledged that COP26 started yesterday. And I'll just mention, this includes President Biden's announcement of something called PREPARE, or the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience. So this is quite significant. This is going to bring together another whole of government approach to support more than 500 million people in developing countries to adapt to and manage impacts of climate change through locally led development. So it's meant to serve as the cornerstone of our government response to the increasing impacts of the global climate crisis. And aid as a leader in this will bring significant experience to bear, including the work and research done by folks in this conference, supporting equitable and inclusive climate resilience. So I won't go into too much more detail since this session is really focused on implications from the Food System Summit. But I will say, as we all know, there's been a steady drumbeat building up through all the high-level events of the year thus far. We're not through yet, and our priorities remain consistent throughout. So, sort of gently re-emphasizing Tom's point about, not reinventing, but really elevating some of the priorities that we see and that we've learned from in sort of the previous iteration of Feed the Future. So keeping with the climate piece of that, we also know as part of the overall vision for food systems and climate change that the US is going to continue to harness the power of research and innovation to support farmers with the right tools. And as part of that, the US and the UAE are jointly launching at COP26 the Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate, which was discussed at the summit as well. So this shorthand, AIM for C, will bring participants together to significantly increase and accelerate investments and support for climate smart agriculture and food systems innovation over the next 5 years. So it's really a call for collective action. It's also focused on leveraging political will and of course, increased cooperation. So while Prepare was announced yesterday and Aim for C was first introduced actually at the Climate Leader Summit, we did formally announce at the Food Systems Summit an investment of $60 million over 5 years in new research awards that will contribute solutions to reduce food loss and waste. So this is one example of honing in on programs that have multiple benefits for helping smallholder farmers adapt to climate change. I'll move on to nutrition, for which we committed to invest $38 million over 5 years to expand large-scale food fortification. So what does this mean? We're working to strengthen country coordination mechanisms to meet this goal. We're continuing to support the private sector and other partners to comply with fortification standards, and also to give partners the ability to reassess current standards in light of updated dietary patterns and evidence. We're calling on other donor partner countries and private sector partners to improve the design and implementation of large-scale fortification programs, and to identify and support key food technology innovations that will further improve the impact of large-scale food fortification. So this is not comprehensive, but I'm giving just sort of a flavor of the commitments we've made and a little bit more detail about what they mean and how they're being underpinned by our global food security strategy. And then lastly, I'll talk to the equity and inclusion elevated priority, really. And in an effort to support inclusive and equitable growth in really targeted ways, we announced a new USAID funded fellowship program for female policymakers in Africa. It's being referred to as GRASP, Gender Responsive Agriculture Systems Policy. So this 3+ year initiative is intended to support 100 female policymakers with things like networking, funding, mentorship, professional development, all to shape policy and remove obstacles to women's participation in food systems transformation. Related to that, we're also funding, or we did fund the pilot of a thing called Global Food 50/50, which was a new monitoring program to hold food system organizations accountable for moving forward on gender equitable work. We're helping to stand up as one of the Food Systems Summit coalitions, a youth coalition. The full title of it is called Boosting Youth Engagement and Employment in Agri-Food Systems, to really step up and amplify commitments and partnerships to promote the full engagement of youth and emerging leaders in the agri-food systems, and really to accelerate the creation of more and better jobs for millions of young people. So we hope that coalition partners will commit to joint efforts focused on achieving this accelerated progress, often against existing commitments and initiatives already out there. I think while not a formal US commitment, one of our most important contributions, at least as I saw it, as part of the larger US role in the lead up to the Food Systems Summit, was helping to make sure that our country counterparts were able to participate meaningfully in the process. This includes through independent dialogues that took place around the world. It includes through supporting the creation of policy documents that reflected country and regional voices that were fed into the process. And I think, to hone in a little bit on the actual policy in light of the commitments we've made at the summit. We are encouraging our Feed the Future interagency policy teams to develop new or aligned existing priorities which advance these commitments. And we'll be providing technical assistance as we have in the past to use these policy matrix tools, which broadly help identify a set of policy results or objectives that advance food security goals in the host countries, and describe specific actions that counterparts can take towards supporting achievement of policy results. And before Ousmane comes in with a criticism, of course, I think these should reinforce existing frameworks, obviously including CADUP, and that's been our approach and intent this entire time. So again, while this is not a comprehensive picture, one last thing I'll note is the equally strong domestic and international components of US involvement and commitments this time around. You probably observed both ag and foreign development ministers involved, which I think is one result of really broadening this to a food systems perspective, right? And while this audience might be more interested in the international development side of the equation, this food systems lens has really provided us an opportunity to think about the consistency of our vision and ambitions at home and abroad. One quick example of this is through another coalition that our Department of Ag is leading on, which I think will really resonate with the conversation that's been had so far. Another long name, a Coalition of Action on Sustainable Productivity Growth for Food Security and Resource Conservation. But for short, it's the Sustainable Productivity Growth Coalition. I think it really helps, hopefully, the public to understand the shared values that we bring to these issues, advocating for an evidence-based approach to technology and innovation, to carefully accelerating the transition to more sustainable food systems. As Ousmane said, we do not want to jeopardize that line that's going up. This really, we hope, helps to start facing head-on the shared challenge that with tightening natural resource constraints, we still need to raise the productivity of existing of production through existing natural resources to meet our food security goals. So the intention of the coalition is really to be one of action that can help to break silos, which include efforts to increase sustainable agriculture productivity that may focus on single objectives, such as water use efficiency or food affordability, and can have unintended consequences on other objectives. So I'm probably out of time.
Yes.
So I'll conclude there, and if there's questions or opportunity for discussion, I can jump in again. Thanks, Will.
Certainly. Thanks very much, Jennifer, for an excellent summary from a different perspective from the others, helping to bring it all together. So before we go to open discussion, we have Will Masters from Tufts University, professor at Tufts University, formerly from Purdue. He brings perspectives on the whole gamut of agricultural economics in Africa, including experience of living and working in Africa. He's promised to bring it all together in 5 minutes. Before Will starts, though, we have no open questions in the dialogue. So as Will speaks and as Will brings out themes, I'd encourage everyone to think of that zinger question that hasn't been answered yet. Just questions, only questions. So please, it's over to you, Will, to bring it all together in 5 minutes.
Yeah, so thank you. So first of all, it's been a great session and really fun to hear these contrasting views. And I want to actually just begin with Jennifer's comments about the Coalition on Sustainable Productivity. So we hadn't talked about that yet in this session until she brought it up at the end. And I want to begin there because it seems to me that is central to US leadership and to what US brings to the Food System Summit, to the UN system, to Africa generally. Our comparative advantage as a country really is very nicely framed by that particular contribution to the UN Food System Summit, which is this coalition on sustainable productivity growth. It was announced in Florence at the G20, explicitly in the context of countering the European farm to fork focus on nutrition and just that nostalgic view that that Tom talked about and David Zilberman talked about. I also want to mention, though, that the US is active, I believe, in the coalition on school meals, and that the US also has leadership to play in nutrition and in safety nets. The US has, of course, the world's premier in-kind safety net in the SNAP and WIC programs, and we have very good school meal programs with very high nutritional standards compared to those in other countries. And so we are contributing to the school meals coalition coming out of the summit, as well as this productivity growth coalition. To sort of connect the dots of the other presentations too, I thought I would just flag a few things from David, from Ousmane, and from Tom. So on David, I thought it was really a great view of that sequence from traditional to food plus to bioeconomy. And the term eco-modernism is used to capture this idea that intensification and technology can decarbonize, dematerialize, reduce the footprint of a high standard of living life. And so our degrowth pattern is already happening through the dematerializing that we get when we move towards renewables in this circular economy. And we're seeing that in agriculture with the rise of more bioreactors and so on and so forth, more biologics generally closing the loops on cycles that were previously hard to understand, hard to model. Now with new data, we can model it better. But there's really three different kinds of research out there, and they're very conflicting, right? So one kind of research is just new facts and what works, kind of randomized trials, new surveys, new data. Another kind of research is how things work, new models, right? Economic models of the cause and effect, biochemical models, crop growth models, and above all, climate models, the integrated. But there's a third kind of research, which is just proving a point. And a huge amount of the scientific literature is just that third kind of literature, right? It's proving a point where people have taken advantage of the open access revolution and social media, where almost anything can be published nowadays and then circulated on Twitter. And what you have is a contribution to the echo chamber, a contribution to the filter bubbles and the self-reinforcing cycles of the mutually congratulatory circles of research, where people are just publishing things that they know the answer to already. They're proving a point, and it's leading to this problem of not breaking out of one's own, and for the US to really lead on ag productivity, countering the European concerns that David flagged. On Ousmane's points about African leadership, I think that is absolutely central, crucial. My own lifespan, I was born in 1961. I began traveling and working in Africa in the 1980s. I began teaching high school in rural Zimbabwe, lots of travel and meeting people all around Southern Africa, and then West Africa and East Africa in the 1990s. And it used to be that African leadership was really limited by, having 55 different governments, while India, unified national democracy, China, a development state, they were able to really get their kind of continents together, their subcontinents together. Africa divided into 55 countries, a harder problem. I think now it's a source of strength for Africa, because as Africa experiences the maturity of its governments going from leader to leader to leader in case after case, and very successful governments like Ethiopia being now in crisis, in question, what is the Ethiopian government really doing as it pursues a sort of borderline genocide situation in its own internal conflicts? What is happening in Nigeria as so much of Nigeria becomes ungovernable? But what we find is that the rest of Africa steps up, and the Africa Union has this extraordinary role to play. And Jeffrey Sachs has a very interesting suggestion that the G20 could become G21 with the Africa Union. And that would really change the nature of the G20 and the opportunity for Africa to speak as one, taking advantage of the fact that it has this diverse leadership and different governments at different times are in positions of strength to speak for the continent, and that perhaps, you know, the South African government, Moroccan government, other governments kind of can step up when countries like Ethiopia fall into periods of less accountability in their government. And then just to bring to an end, you know, comments from Tom, and really inspiring and interesting and fun. And I really appreciate Tom's efforts to find the right turn of phrase, right? That, you know, the idea that it's not a missing middle, it's a hidden middle. The idea that infrastructure is the blood and bones, the sinews of the economy, and we need to, an agricultural economy, we need to understand that, and the need to not reinvent the wheel. And I think that his points are all absolutely spot on about not reinventing the wheel and building on what we know and trying to understand how to do that at scale in the African context based on the lessons from elsewhere. So I hope that's helpful to frame and to bring us back to the USAID agenda and the different coalitions that are coming out of the UN Food System Summit, as well as the other kinds of initiatives that are happening outside the summit. And the one point I want to just end on is the idea that this focus on the greenhouse gas that is most urgent to deal with, that came out from the start in Glasgow, is methane. And the really great opportunity that we have to steer our beef and dairy sectors towards a lower methane path is something that we can really accomplish. And if USAID and global agriculture can set the development of a beef and dairy sector that successfully addresses this challenge of sharply reducing enteric methane emissions, that would be, you know, a really valuable merger of this, what David Zilberman called this kind of food plus or bioeconomy approach with the climate agenda. So thanks very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Will, for that staggering achievement of bringing almost everything together in a very valuable synthesis. There aren't any questions in the chat at the moment, and I'm sure that's something that's going to be rectified momentarily. So, but to just get things started, I'd like to follow up with Will's question. Great, we have one observation there, but just to follow up from Will's question about the focus on methane, I think this is a very interesting part, interesting recent development, because it appears that, and Jock mentioned this as well in an earlier presentation, it appears that the changing rations for livestock can actually give you both the productivity increase and reductions in emissions, so that this improvement in technology could play a very valuable role. And it's quite a different angle from the agroecology, some of the agroecology proposals which involve taking a sacrifice on productivity, which would be very, very difficult for Africa to do. So I hope that provokes some comments. We also have two questions in the chat. One from Regina. I think everyone can read these. And Regina is pointing to initiatives that implement the idea that agroecology can be very, very helpful in the South. And I think the changing livestock rations actually are another example of something that can be helpful in both improving productivity and being kind of agroecological and lowering emissions. So, Keith Fugley has a question for Tom Reardon, the blood and bones question. How dependent is African food systems on raising farm productivity? So I think if the agroecology point, the need, the imperative of increasing productivity, I think that must generate some comment. I think I see Ousmane ready to pounce.
Not ready to pounce.
Go for it.
I have had a lot of discussions about it. There's no question that the science behind the concept of agroecology is solid. What I haven't seen yet is a development strategic implication of that. In other words, where in the world has agroecology been able to boost productivity, sustain it, allow the multipliers to take place that boost agriculture sector growth to create employment and jobs and reduce poverty and food insecurity? We haven't had that body of evidence, right? It has been shown that it's very important in helping with mitigation, and the review that was done by the CGIAR is saying that it's been proven to be effective in the North. We didn't have the evidence in the South. So for me, it looks like a very good idea that needs to be tested more, that we need to be working with a little bit further to see really how far it can serve as the bedrock of development. If you want to embrace it as the way of doing business in Africa, it ought to deliver on those 5 points that I talked about. It's just not good for it to deliver on one and not the other 5. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ousmane, for that excellent, excellent point. I think it's a guideline for all of us. Any other responses from the panel or the floor or questions? I think Jennifer
I'll
is
jump
just, yes, please.
So yeah, I might get in trouble with this. It's a hot topic for the US government. But, you know, I do want to say that USAID is very much focused on an outcomes approach, right? And sustainable agriculture is determined by outcomes. I think many other speakers today have acknowledged, you know, farmers don't want to choose the method that is not sustainable, just to put that in simple terms. And so how we prefer to frame these issues to lessen any confusion about what we're talking about is to really talk about it as sustainable agriculture. I think the issue that we see come out is, insofar as agroecology has been co-opted as a political social movement, we maintain and want to be very clear with farmers we work with that they do not need to be part of a political movement to practice sound agroecological principles. And I think, you know, some of the principles that organizations stand behind include some that have been raised as potentially problematic here. And again, everything is context specific, but if we're talking about local, right? Sure, sometimes that makes sense. So one of them is around ensuring proximity between producers and consumers. That has to be context specific, right? Input reduction and increasing self-sufficiency. There's a lot to unpack there. Sometimes that makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. And I'll just defer again to Ousmane's presentation and remarks around a lot of that. So thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. So far, no one has picked up Keith Fugley's question, which is, in a sense, and this I think is really one for Tom, the trade-off between the blood and bones of infrastructure and the blood and bones of research and development for raising productivity.
Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed. Fire away.
Okay. Yes. Very paradoxically, I'm walking to a research and development institution called Michigan State University to teach my 1 o'clock class. So you're hearing me huff and puff in the cold wind. But I think that I include research and development institutions in the set of overall infrastructure. I just happened to mention, market-oriented infrastructure because I was, trying to emphasize that there was such a goal of reinventing the wheel and starting markets and starting food access, when already Africa has shown one of the great success stories of increasing food access and food supply chains in developing regions. And it just needs to be reinforced. When I go from country to country and talk with governments, very often there's an underappreciation or an underinvestment in wholesale markets and updating and improving wholesale markets. Yet probably 85% of the food that's moved in Africa is moved by the wholesale markets. And they're often with infrastructure from the 1970s. And it's the same thing with roads. Obviously, extremely high transaction costs in Africa impede. And what we found in our earlier work, my earlier hat was African agricultural productivity that I did in the 1990s for USAID. Basically, we found that if you were a producer, a farmer that was linked to urban markets through adequate infrastructure, et cetera, you had 13 times higher probability of using soil conservation investments, manure, talk about agroecology, and also fertilizer. And so a lot of the things that were being suggested by research and development institutions were really very dependent on the market incentive being there to take it up. And what we found very often is that when it was just a subsistence crop, in that time we were looking at Rwanda sweet potatoes and millet and many things like that, there was very little farm investment in anything that didn't pay. And a Rwandan farmer once put it to me, we put money on money, okay, so that we invest in things that we think are going to pay in the market. So the markets have to be there for research and development to have a fertile soil in which they put their seed. But on the other hand, without the actions of the research and development institutions and the improvements to be able to adapt to technologies, and sometimes, like I cite more the case of India, where investment in disease-resistant and shelf-stable potato varieties ended up creating a huge boom in cold storage and in potato production and the supply chain surge. And all those things were dependent on the confluence of the research and development institutions putting the right varieties in place, and the fact that there was road improvement and electrification that allowed the cold storages to rise. All that produced an incentive for the farmers to take up the new varieties and also themselves use the cold storages. You had a complete revolution in 10 years. And it's really hand in hand, research and development and bones and blood. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that point. Complementarity between
Yes,
the two inputs. So you're released, Tom, for your class. You have, if you need to go. Thanks very much. Great.
Thanks.
We have a question in the chat from Jim Gaffney about the possibilities of reducing emissions from rice production. I guess I've heard of alternate wetting and drying amongst the other possibilities that Jim mentions, and I'm wondering whether does anyone have any questions or comments on that area of methane reduction, as well as the livestock one that I flagged earlier. No questions, no comments.
Can I comment? Can I comment on the question by Keith? But yes. Not this one. Okay. I'm not competent to address this one, but I can discuss a little bit on in case there is no question, actually, that Africa has to intensify sustainably, but we do have to intensify. If you just listen to the last 24 hours, the major commitment to reduce deforestation is going to be a major constraint to what Africa has done primarily in the past. Growing output by expanding agricultural areas. This is no longer sustainable. I don't even think it really should make sense also in the future. So we'll have to intensify, albeit sustainably, in agriculture. So that means that the science and technology innovations that are needed for better seeds and other market-based inputs, how we can use them more effectively and efficiently. How do we use better seed technologies to deal with climate change, drought-resilient seeds, salt-resilient seeds, nitrogen-efficient seeds? How do we have more pest resilience, disease-resilient seeds dealing with the changing climate? all this is heavy science stuff that needs to be done. And that's why also the ideological approach to things like agroecology is not helpful. Africa is one of the most vulnerable continents vis-a-vis climate change. So resilience and sustainability cannot be achieved in Africa without heavy use of science and technology. So any approach that says no to modern inputs, that is completely opposed to biotechnology, that doesn't really look at the role of trade, that says no to research because farmers know better, and you really do hear that, that look at any aspects of using modern science and technology for agriculture intensification as quote unquote green revolution and therefore to be banned. That is not helpful. So that's why I think the best dialogue and debate for Africa is to focus on the outcomes. Are we helping African countries become more productive and more resilient and sustaining our growth path and so on and so forth? That will be really the best way to do this. Unfortunately, the discussion around agroecology has turned into an ideological discussion that is not helping very much. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Ousmane. That's very helpful to clarify that issue. I think we have only about 4 minutes left. So one thing perhaps that might be useful would be if we just went through the panelists in order of appearance, except for Tom and David, but just with a very short observation each that perhaps brings out either complementarity or unresolved tensions between the perspectives of each of the panelists. So since Ousmane just spoke, perhaps we should start with Jennifer and work back. Jennifer, would you have a short summarizing, synthesizing?
Sure, I don't know if it's a summary, but I think given the chance, there's one point I want to highlight, which is, that to affect change, we really need to try and work with what's on the ground already. So I think this maybe just continues to magnify what Ousmane and others are saying, but countries and communities have already built frameworks and ways of working for themselves that don't necessarily fit into neat boxes, as part of a UN Food System Summit or for the sake of donors or implementing partners, et cetera. And so talking about inclusive growth, we know that demands local leadership. And if we're really talking about local leadership, we also need to be uncomfortable with trying to fit ourselves into what's potentially there already, even if we don't think it's perfect, to try and work to make it better, if there really is room for that. And then just really quickly, also to continue on the, not reinventing the wheel. I think the US position has been an insistence to that new bureaucracies not be created, right? And that those that do already exist, including our UN food security agencies, really need to work with, the countries and communities that they're serving to implement demand-driven solutions. So lastly, it's just understanding and recognizing the value adds of each of us, whether it's convening power, being able to host inclusive multi-stakeholder platforms, whether it's in implementation or supporting programs at the country level or as an oversight body, or as generating really useful research. Let's lean into the areas that we know we add the most value. Thanks, Will.
Great, thanks very much, Jennifer. Will, would you like to make any additional observations?
I just really want to hear what Ousmane might think of the idea of the Africa Union playing a bigger role on the world stage, and what the academia can contribute to that. And perhaps even specifically joining the G20. And I don't know that other G20 members would welcome them, but is the Africa Union, in Ousmane's view, able to take that diversity of voices from within Africa and represent the continent in a unified way?
Great question. And now our final observation from Ousmane from the heart of Africa. What do you think?
Well, thank you. What a tough question. How can we look at this as work in progress? I think it's easier to stand up and have a position to be announced to the global community like the African Union did at the Global Food Systems Summit with the Africa position papers that we helped draft. It's more difficult when then you come back and you want to implement what you told the world that you are for or standing for. So we are much better than we have been in the past to come together as African Union and have a position. We're still struggling with being able to deliver on those, but I think the last few years has shown then around CADEP that and the Malabo Declaration that African countries are able to deliver, although not as perfectly as it is, but is there anything perfect in the world? So we are moving there forward in this capacity. You have also seen that they will have launched in Glasgow the Green Recovery Plan, which is Africa's answer, so to say, to climate change mitigation adaptation. So Africa is stepping up to the plate in terms of having a position and defending it. And they have shown with Malabo and CADEP that they can lead. But of course, there's so many different other areas that we need to lead and to do that. But we are in a much better position now than ever. Where we would want to be, of course not. But there's good substance evidence on the ground that we can do that with whatever infrastructure we have. We are ready to do that. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone. What a great panel. What interesting ideas. And I look forward to continuing the discussion afterwards. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. And this was really great. Thank you for having us.
On behalf of the Rutgers group, this was a really great session. Thanks very much for all your participation.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Yeah, very interesting.
Thanks, Cal.
We'll hope to see you guys tomorrow. Lots of excitement tomorrow too, no doubt.
Right.